It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, or so it seemed. The sky was painted in hues of soft orange as the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows of a seemingly peaceful suburban home. Yet within its walls, a storm was brewing, a storm so violent and unforgiving that it would shatter everything in its wake. No one would suspect that the blood of a mother would be spilled by the very hands that once held her in tender affection, her own son. The day began like any other, with the hum of the refrigerator, the whir of the coffee maker, and the soft shuffle of morning routines. But that morning, something was different. There was an air of finality, as though the end had already been decided. And for Ethan, the son, this would be the day he took control over everything, finally. The day he freed himself from the chains that had bound him for so long. The Anderson family seemed, from the outside, like the picture of suburban bliss. Their house was nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by well-manicured lawns and friendly neighbors. Carol, the mother, had a reputation for being a perfectionist. She was always well-dressed, always polite, always on top of her game. And she expected nothing less from her family. Ethan, her youngest son, had always been the apple of her eye, until he wasn't. From a young age, Ethan had been raised under the crushing weight of his mother's expectations. She was a woman who prided herself on control of her surroundings, her home, and most importantly, her children. Carol was determined to make Ethan into someone exceptional, someone who would rise above mediocrity. Nothing he did seemed to satisfy her. It wasn't enough that he got straight A's or excelled in sports, she wanted more. She always wanted more. Ethan, now 16, was beginning to feel the burden of her relentless demands. He spent his days buried in books, his evenings consumed by sports practice, but no matter what he did, he could never make his mother proud. She constantly compared him to other kids, never acknowledging his accomplishments unless they were better than the best. His older sister, Rebecca, was already on her way to becoming a medical student, a success story that Carol never let Ethan forget. But it wasn't just the constant comparisons that bothered Ethan. It was the way his mother controlled every aspect of his life. She dictated his friends, his hobbies, even his meals. She'd constantly monitor his online activity, ensuring that no distractions, no bad influences, could creep into his life. His personal space was a cage, a carefully curated, sterile environment that left no room for personal freedom. Carol's love, if it could even be called that, was conditional. It was a love that came with strings attached. And those strings tightened every day. Ethan's father, Michael, was a man of few words. He was a corporate lawyer, perpetually consumed by his work. When he was home, he was distant, emotionally unavailable. Ethan had long given up on seeking his father's approval. Michael was there, but he was never really present. He never noticed the bruises Ethan wore on the inside, never noticed the growing resentment and rage that was festering inside his son. Ethan's online search history paints a different picture, a stark contrast to the calm, innocent exterior he presented to the world. Among the ordinary homework-related searches, there were darker queries. How to break free from controlling parents. Revenge on overbearing mothers. What is matricide? These were not the searches of a boy looking for answers, they were the searches of someone plotting escape, searching for a way to break the shackles that had confined him for years. One search caught the attention of a forensic investigator later on. How does it feel to kill your mother? It was a question loaded with a chilling intent, and one that would later haunt the investigators as they pieced together the tragic events. It was the night before the murder that Ethan truly began to prepare. Carol was sitting at the dinner table, discussing Rebecca's latest academic achievements, as usual. She was oblivious to the tension that was building in the room, unaware of the storm brewing in her son's mind. Ethan had spent the evening stewing in his own thoughts, his mind racing with a plan that had been slowly forming for months. Carol's voice was distant, like white noise to him. Every word that came out of her mouth felt like a dagger, and yet he said nothing. He had become an expert at hiding his feelings, at playing the part of the dutiful son, all while burning with resentment on the inside. But tonight, there would be no more pretending. Tonight, he would end the charade. The house was dark now, the only light coming from the dim glow of the kitchen. Ethan stood in his room, staring at the photograph of his mother on the wall, a smile frozen on her face, a smile that had always seemed so false to him. The knife in the kitchen caught his eye, gleaming under the fluorescent light. It was the perfect tool. Small, sharp, and quiet. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt in control. There was no more fear, no more doubt. The power he had been yearning for was finally within his grasp. Ethan crept down the hallway to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The sound felt deafening in the silence of the night. He paused at the door, watching his mother as she hummed softly to herself, completely unaware of the storm about to unfold. He reached for the knife, his hands trembling not with fear, but with a strange exhilaration. This was it. This was his moment. Without a word, without a sound, Ethan closed the distance. The moment his mother turned to face him, he lunged. His grip on the knife tightened as it sank into her chest, the force of it knocking her back against the countertop. Carol gasped in shock, but it was too late. Ethan, his face void of emotion, twisted the knife with precision, watching as her life began to slip away. Her body shook, but she could not escape. Not this time. The entire scene took less than 3 minutes. But for Ethan, it felt like an eternity, a dark, intoxicating eternity where he finally felt free. Free from the chains, free from the constant torment. As his mother's blood pooled beneath her, he stood over her, not with remorse, but with a twisted sense of relief. How could a son do such a thing? What led him to this breaking point? Was it really just the pressure of his mother's control? Or was there something more sinister lurking in his past? Stay tuned as we uncover more about Ethan's twisted psychology and what happens next. But don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this story is just getting started. Ethan calmly placed the knife back in its holder, wiping his hands clean of any trace of blood. He turned off the lights and went to bed, as though nothing had happened. But the chill in the air, the sense of finality, was inescapable. Ethan lay awake in his bed, listening to the sound of his own heart pounding in his chest. The feeling of power lingered. Tomorrow, everything would change. But for now, the world was his. The silence that followed Carol's death was unnerving. Ethan's breath came heavy, but his hands were steady. As the house stood still, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator to break the quiet, Ethan could feel the weight of his actions settle around him. In those first few moments after the murder, he felt no remorse, no fear, only exhilaration. But what happens when the adrenaline fades, and the reality of what he's done sinks in? The answers are far darker than anyone could have imagined. The morning after the murder, the house felt eerily calm. Carol's body lay cold on the kitchen floor, but to Ethan, it was nothing more than a final symbol of his liberation. The clock ticked loudly, and the world outside the windows continued as if nothing had changed. Ethan had not been sleeping. He had not cried. What most would consider the natural, human reaction to such a brutal act, the shock, the grief, the horror, was absent in him. Instead, there was a strange sense of satisfaction, like a weight had been lifted from his chest. Ethan's first act upon waking was disturbingly pragmatic. He went about cleaning the crime scene. The knife was wiped down, and Carol's blood was scrubbed from the floor. The house needed to be restored to its pristine condition. As though nothing had happened. As though his mother had simply disappeared, as though the walls would not tell a story of murder in the years to come. His actions were mechanical, but quiet, calculated. He even took the time to arrange the scene as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Carol had always prided herself on maintaining a spotless home. Now, it was his turn to ensure it stayed that way. However, Ethan's attempt to erase the evidence was incomplete. Beneath the veneer of cleanliness, a single, unmistakable clue remained, a smear of blood on the doorframe, barely noticeable but undeniable. It wasn't enough to draw immediate attention, but it would be enough to make the detectives suspicious once they began to look closely. Ethan knew he had to act quickly. His plan had been flawless in the immediate aftermath. No one had seen him with blood on his hands. But something gnawed at him. He felt it like an itch he couldn't scratch, the creeping awareness that everything was about to unravel. Ethan went about his day as though everything was normal. He went to school, though his thoughts were a million miles away. He sat in his classes, barely registering what was going on around him. The other students were oblivious to the dark secret he was carrying. His friends, who had seen him as nothing more than an aloof, introverted teenager, had no idea that he had just committed an unthinkable crime. But despite his calm exterior, Ethan's mind raced. His mother had always been the center of his world, and her death was the catalyst that would finally set him free. Yet, even as he walked the halls, felt the gaze of his classmates upon him, he was haunted by a different feeling, one that he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't guilt. It was something darker. Something more insidious. That night, as he lay in bed, the terror of what he had done crept over him in waves. For the first time, he felt an overwhelming need to break the silence of his mind. The walls felt like they were closing in, and he needed to tell someone. Later that evening, just as the sun began to set, the doorbell rang. It was the police. 2 officers stood in the doorway, looking somber, but not yet suspicious. "Is everything all right, Ethan?" Detective Miller asked, her tone polite but firm. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had not expected this so soon. "Yes, of course," Ethan responded, trying to remain calm. His pulse was racing, and his palms were sweating, but his face remained neutral. The detectives wanted to talk to him about his mother. The officers asked routine questions, questions about the family, about Carol's health, about the events leading up to her death. They asked if he had seen anything unusual the night before. Ethan's answers were measured, his voice steady. "She was fine last night," he said, his voice a little too calm. "We had dinner, and then I went to bed. She went to bed after me." Carol's body had been discovered only hours ago, and yet Ethan's composure remained unsettling. His answers seemed almost rehearsed, though he was careful to avoid sounding too perfect. The detectives couldn't place it yet, but something didn't sit right with them. The truth was starting to come to the surface, though not quite yet. Later that evening, after the detectives had left, Ethan went through his mother's personal items. He went through her diary, her papers, anything that might provide an explanation for what had happened. He was searching for a reason, a justification. After all, no one had asked if his side of the story was true. No one had asked why he had done it. His mother had never given him that chance, had she? She'd never once stopped to ask what he wanted. Ethan's fingers hovered over the papers, but the answers didn't come. There were no reasons, no signs of what had driven him to this act. He had done it because he was tired, tired of the control, tired of the pressure, tired of the constant expectations. He had killed her because she had refused to let him breathe. It was as if a weight had lifted from his shoulders when he thought of the death. It was wrong, it was horrifying, but it was also liberating. He could finally breathe. The following day, as the police continued their investigation, they found more evidence that made them begin to question Ethan's involvement. It wasn't just the blood smear on the doorframe, it was the fact that the crime scene appeared staged. The cleanup effort, while meticulous, was not perfect. There were subtle signs of tampering, of things out of place, even if Ethan thought he had erased all traces. One of the officers had found a key piece of evidence, a text message from Carol, sent the night of her death, to a friend. The message was cryptic, "I'm worried about Ethan. Something isn't right." Detective Miller, who had already grown suspicious, now believed that Ethan had known about his mother's fear, and perhaps, just maybe, had acted on it. But there was more. The text had been sent at the very time that Carol was allegedly murdered. How did the detectives miss the signs in front of them? Could Ethan really be this cold-hearted? Stay tuned as the investigation deepens. Will Ethan's cold exterior crack under the pressure? If you're hooked, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to this case than meets the eye. Hit that bell so you don't miss out on the truth. In a later scene, Detective Miller reviews the footage from the house's security cameras. The images show Ethan walking past the kitchen door, his face expressionless, almost robotic. He doesn't flinch as he passes his mother's lifeless body. It's as though the act itself never really happened for him. He had killed Carol, but it was as if she had never really existed. He was alone now, truly alone, with nothing but the silent remnants of his actions. As Ethan walked through his house, everything felt different. The familiar sounds, the familiar sights, now felt hollow. There was no one to stop him. There was no one to hold him accountable. The only thing that mattered was the next step, covering his tracks, maintaining control. But in his gut, a gnawing suspicion lingered. Could he really get away with it? Could he really hide from the truth forever? Ethan tried to push the thought aside, but deep down, he knew the walls were closing in. Just when Ethan thought he could keep his secret hidden, the past came rushing back. The cracks in his perfect facade were beginning to show. Detective Miller wasn't just asking the right questions, she was getting too close. Ethan thought he had covered his tracks, but what if there were deeper, darker layers of his psyche waiting to be exposed? The investigation was no longer just about the crime, it was about unearthing the monster hiding inside him. Days after the murder, Ethan had successfully managed to maintain a facade of normalcy. The police weren't pressing him too hard yet, and the small smear of blood on the doorframe hadn't raised enough suspicion for them to dig deeper. Life seemed to return to its ordinary rhythm, with Ethan walking through his day as if nothing had changed. But the weight of what he had done, the brutal, heartless murder of his own mother, hung over him, gnawing at him, even when his face remained expressionless. However, Detective Miller wasn't fooled. The unsettling calm that Ethan projected only made her more suspicious. She began to piece together inconsistencies in his story, discrepancies in his alibi, vague recollections of the previous evening, and the odd timing of his social media posts. There was something in Ethan's demeanor that made her question whether the son was truly grieving, or if he was hiding something far more sinister. Her investigation began to focus more on Ethan's history. She pulled up school records, spoke to former teachers, and even contacted his childhood friends. What she found was unsettling. Ethan wasn't just the troubled son of an overbearing mother. He was a time bomb, slowly ticking his way toward violence. As Detective Miller dug deeper into Ethan's past, she discovered troubling incidents that had been ignored or overlooked for years. Ethan had a history of violent outbursts, but they had always been downplayed. His teachers remembered his dark sense of humor, how he would laugh at violent video games, make morbid jokes, and talk about death in ways that were deeply unsettling for a boy his age. One particular incident stood out. In 7th grade, Ethan had pushed a classmate down a flight of stairs during a scuffle over a trivial argument. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but the intent was clear. Ethan had acted with cold aggression. The school had swept the matter under the rug, labeling it as a lapse in judgment, a moment of anger. His parents had brushed it off, refusing to acknowledge that their son had a problem. But as Miller traced Ethan's psychological history further, she found that these outbursts were not isolated incidents. Ethan had been to therapy twice in his life, once at the age of 11, when he started having violent fantasies, and again at 15 when he showed signs of severe depression. Each time, his mother insisted on the sessions, but only because it was something she could control. When the therapists made progress in understanding the deep-rooted issues that lay within Ethan, Carol would quickly pull him out of therapy, claiming it was no longer necessary. No one had ever pushed Ethan to confront his demons for long enough. Miller also found his journals. Pages upon pages of disturbing rants, ramblings about his hatred for his mother, his desire for revenge, and his sense of being trapped in a life that wasn't his. One entry, in particular, caught her attention. "She thinks she knows me. She doesn't. No one knows me. I'm smarter than all of them. I'll show them all. They'll regret it when I'm free." As Miller pored over Ethan's past, she began to connect the dots. His violent behavior wasn't a result of a single moment of stress. It was the culmination of years of psychological abuse, emotional neglect, and a complete lack of emotional support. Ethan's mother had conditioned him to feel worthless, inferior, and incapable of ever living up to her impossible standards. But instead of breaking him, it had hardened him. Carol's control had pushed Ethan into a corner, and now he had broken free. But how had Ethan gone from a troubled teen with anger issues to a cold-blooded killer? What had happened that night? the night of the murder, that made him snap. Miller couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Ethan's personality than met the eye, a dark, calculating side that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. The more Miller learned, the more it became clear that Ethan had never truly been the person his family thought he was. Underneath his quiet, withdrawn demeanor was a mind capable of the most unimaginable horrors. But the question remained, had he always been this way, or had something pushed him over the edge? Ethan's mother, Carol, had never been a passive victim in her own right. As Miller dug deeper, she discovered that Carol had been just as emotionally abusive to her husband, Michael. The dynamics within the family were a toxic mess. Carol had controlled every aspect of Michael's life, stripping him of his voice and turning him into a ghost of a man. It was no surprise that he had retreated into his work, leaving his son and wife to create their own dysfunctional world. Miller soon uncovered a secret, an affair. A year before Carol's death, Michael had been having an affair with a woman from his office. Carol had discovered it, and instead of confronting Michael about it, she had become even more controlling, more demanding. She placed more pressure on Ethan to be the perfect child, as though his success would be the thing that saved their family. She had imposed impossible expectations on him, even as she crushed his father's spirit with her manipulative behavior. What Miller was beginning to realize was that Ethan's rage wasn't just the result of years of maternal control. It was a rage fueled by a family on the brink of collapse, two parents who had failed him in different ways, and a mother who had treated him like an object to be shaped rather than a person with his own needs, wants, and desires. What do you think pushed Ethan to the breaking point? Was it just his mother's control, or was there more to this family dynamic than we know? Stick around as we delve further into Ethan's twisted psyche. Make sure to subscribe, because you won't want to miss the shocking revelations still to come. This investigation is unraveling, but we're just scratching the surface. Let us know what you think in the comments below. How much of this is Ethan's fault, and how much of it is a family's collective dysfunction? Hit that like button if you're intrigued by the truth yet to be uncovered. As the investigation continued, Miller found more disturbing clues that pointed to the twisted nature of Ethan's psyche. In his school locker, among his textbooks, was a detailed sketchbook filled with drawings of disturbing scenes, violent depictions of his mother's death. The images were not crude, they were precise, calculated, each line reflecting Ethan's growing obsession with his plan. There was one particular sketch that stood out, Carol, pinned to the ground, blood spilling from her chest. The detail was so accurate, it was as though Ethan had been rehearsing the murder in his mind for weeks, even months. That night, Ethan lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He didn't feel remorse. He didn't feel guilt. What he felt was something far more terrifying, control. He had taken back what was rightfully his. He had destroyed the source of his suffering, and now he was free. But with each passing day, the realization of what he had done began to creep in. The pressure from the investigation, the detectives closing in on his every move, the mounting evidence, it was all starting to break through his calm exterior. For the first time since the murder, Ethan began to feel the weight of his actions. His world, built on lies, was starting to crumble. Would he be able to keep his dark secret hidden, or would the truth tear him apart before the authorities could catch up? Ethan thought he had it all under control. But as the detective's questions grew more persistent, his carefully constructed lies began to unravel. What began as an act of liberation had now become a desperate game of survival. With every move, Ethan tried to cover his tracks, each lie more elaborate than the last. But how far could he go before the truth caught up with him? The days following Carol's death passed in a blur for Ethan. Life outside the investigation carried on, with people going about their business as usual, unaware of the storm brewing in the Anderson home. For Ethan, every hour was filled with growing anxiety. He had murdered his mother, ripped her from his life with brutal, decisive action, and yet, now that she was gone, the haunting specter of guilt was creeping in. But rather than face it, Ethan doubled down, building layer upon layer of deception to protect himself from the consequences of his actions. The morning after Detective Miller's visit, Ethan's demeanor shifted. No longer the confused son grieving his mother's death, he became the master of his own narrative. He began to manipulate the facts, crafting a story that fit the image he wanted the police to see. His mother's death was no longer the result of a violent outburst, it was a tragedy. An accident. A random act of violence by an unknown intruder, someone who had somehow managed to breach the security of the Anderson home. Ethan went over his plan in his head as he walked to school, his mind running through every possibility. What would he say if the police came back to ask more questions? What if someone from school noticed something odd in his behavior? He couldn't afford to slip up. Ethan's attempt to rewrite the narrative came in the form of a phone call. At lunch that day, Ethan texted his father, Michael, urging him to come home early. The timing was suspicious. Michael had been absent since Carol's death, his presence little more than a shadow in the house. But when Michael arrived that evening, Ethan greeted him with a calm, almost rehearsed demeanor, ready to play the role of the grieving son. "Dad, I don't know what happened. She was just here," and then Ethan paused, his voice wavering ever so slightly. "I heard a noise in the house. The door was open. I thought I was dreaming, but when I went to check on her, she was gone." Michael stood in the doorway, his face pale with exhaustion. He hadn't wanted to return home, but the look in Ethan's eyes gave him no choice. "Did you call the police?" he asked weakly. Ethan nodded, feigning confusion and distress. "I tried. I thought I could handle it, but I don't know how to explain it," Ethan stammered, feigning concern. Michael looked at him, his face a mixture of disbelief and something else, maybe guilt, maybe worry. The truth was, Michael had never been the father Ethan needed. He had never been strong enough to protect him from Carol's cruelty, nor strong enough to help him find his own path. But even Michael could see that something didn't add up. The calmness in Ethan's voice was unsettling. The distance in his eyes was chilling. Still, the lack of evidence made it difficult to suspect anything beyond what Ethan had described. The next day, the police came back. Detective Miller had questions, and Ethan's answers were becoming more rehearsed. He had already told them everything he thought they needed to hear, the story about the intruder, about hearing strange noises, about how he found his mother after the supposed break-in. Miller's questions were persistent, though. She asked for a reenactment, a closer look at the scene of the crime. She asked about the time of death, about any strange occurrences in the days leading up to Carol's death, about Ethan's relationship with his mother. Ethan's answers were deliberate, but Miller's gaze remained unwavering. She was looking for something, anything, that would give away his lie. But Ethan, cool and calculated, was careful not to let his mask slip. Every word he spoke was weighed, measured, and controlled. But the cracks were starting to show. In the meantime, Miller began to dig into the details of the supposed break-in. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle outside the kitchen. Nothing about the scene supported the narrative Ethan had crafted. The door was unlocked, but it was still intact. There were no fingerprints on the knife or the kitchen counters. The kitchen window, a supposed point of entry for the intruder, had never been opened. The whole scene was disturbingly clean. The small smear of blood on the doorframe, initially brushed off as an accident, now stood out in stark contrast to the rest of the crime scene. It wasn't just a small drop, it was a trace of blood that had been intentionally wiped away, smeared in an odd pattern. Someone had tried to clean up the scene, but they hadn't been careful enough. And the question now became, why? As Miller continued to investigate, a new detail emerged, an unexpected lead that would take the case in a completely new direction. The police had received a tip from a local shopkeeper who had seen someone leaving the Anderson house late the night before the murder. The shopkeeper had described the person as tall, with dark hair, and wearing a jacket that seemed too bulky for the weather. The description fit Michael perfectly. At first, it seemed like a fluke, maybe someone just confused Michael for someone else. But Miller's suspicions had been piqued. She had already started to wonder if Michael had played a larger role in Carol's death than he was letting on. Had he known about Ethan's violent tendencies? Had he known about the growing tension between mother and son? Had he been complicit in hiding the truth? Miller confronted Michael with the new information. Michael, looking visibly shaken, denied everything. I was home. I didn't leave the house, he protested. But the cracks in his story were beginning to show. I know what you're trying to imply, detective, he continued, but I have nothing to hide. I wasn't involved in anything. I don't know what happened. I wasn't there for them, and I failed as a father. But I didn't kill her. The more Michael spoke, the more Miller wondered if the truth was hiding in plain sight. Had Michael unknowingly been a silent accomplice in this tragic event by allowing his family to fall apart without intervening? Or had Ethan truly acted alone, as he had insisted all along? Could Michael really be the one who's been hiding something all along? Is he truly innocent, or is he hiding a darker truth? Keep watching to find out the next shocking turn in this twisted tale. We've seen Ethan's lies start to unravel, but is the worst yet to come? Hit that subscribe button to stay with us as we dive deeper into this mystery. Can Ethan keep his story straight, or will the lies finally catch up to him? As Detective Miller continued to piece together the fragments of evidence, she noticed something else that stood out, a fingerprint on the back of the kitchen chair, smeared in a strange way, as though someone had sat down to think, to plan. A small, subtle detail that Ethan had overlooked. Miller couldn't shake the feeling that every inch of the crime scene was speaking to her, whispering the truth that Ethan had tried so desperately to suppress. Ethan sat alone in his room, his hands trembling as he stared at the walls. The lies had worked for so long, but now they were slipping away from him. The police were getting closer. The walls were closing in. What had started as an act of liberation was becoming a prison in its own right. Every time the doorbell rang, every time someone knocked at the door, Ethan felt his heart race. The truth was coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And as Ethan lay in bed that night, a new thought consumed him, a thought that scared him more than anything else. What would happen when they finally found out? Every criminal cracks. The strongest facade crumbles when the pressure becomes too much to bear. Ethan had played the role of the grieving son, the innocent bystander, for far too long. But now, with Detective Miller closing in, the walls of his carefully constructed lies were beginning to crack. What happens when a murderer is cornered, when there is no escape from the consequences? What happens when Ethan is finally forced to confront the truth about what he did, and why? It had been weeks since Carol's death, and the investigation had grown more intense with every passing day. Ethan had been playing his part well, attending school, feigning confusion, maintaining the story about the break-in. But the cracks were becoming impossible to hide. Every question from Detective Miller, every inquiry from friends or acquaintances, felt like a ticking clock in his head, counting down to the moment when everything would come crashing down. The quiet, suburban town where the Andersons lived now buzzed with whispers. Everyone had their theories about Carol's death, but no one suspected the quiet, withdrawn son. They didn't know Ethan like Detective Miller was beginning to. Ethan had been careful, too careful. And now, as the police dug deeper into his past, into his psyche, Ethan realized that his grip on the situation was slipping. His world, once filled with a perverse sense of control, was now unraveling, one thread at a time. The police had begun to connect the dots between his violent tendencies in his childhood and the brutal crime scene they'd found in his house. But Ethan couldn't back down. He had to maintain his story. He couldn't afford to be exposed, not now, not when he had come so far. Detective Miller's breakthrough came when she finally found the missing link, the crucial piece that would crack Ethan's story wide open. The police had re-examined the murder weapon, the kitchen knife that had been used to kill Carol. Despite Ethan's efforts to clean it, the blade still had traces of DNA, Carol's blood mixed with something else. There was a second set of prints on the knife, faint but detectable. It wasn't enough to immediately implicate anyone else, but it was enough to cast doubt on Ethan's narrative. Furthermore, Miller discovered a disturbing piece of evidence in Ethan's bedroom, a journal entry that was chilling in its clarity. Ethan had written it just days before the murder. She doesn't know it, but I've made my peace. I'm ready to finally take control. This will be the last time she holds me down. The world will be better off without her. She's weak, and I'm stronger now. The chilling finality of those words made it impossible for Miller to ignore the truth any longer. Ethan had planned this. He had been preparing for this moment for months. He was not the confused, grief-stricken son that he appeared to be. He was a killer, and the evidence was stacking up against him. The police had enough evidence to confront Ethan directly, and they did just that. Ethan sat in the interrogation room, his eyes darting nervously around as Miller entered. She was calm, collected, her face unreadable. She sat across from him, the silence thick and heavy between them. "Ethan," she began, her voice steady but firm. "We've been through your story, over and over. And now, we're at the point where it doesn't add up anymore. There's something you're not telling us. There's something you're hiding. And I need you to be honest with me." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to keep his composure, to remain calm, but the pressure was too much. He swallowed hard, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "I've already told you everything I know," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "I didn't do this. I didn't kill her. I didn't hurt my mother." Miller leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "We found the journal, Ethan. We found your writing. The anger you've been carrying inside for all these years. You think we don't see it? You're not fooling anyone." Ethan's face went pale. His lips trembled as he struggled to maintain control. The room seemed to spin around him. He had never imagined it would come to this. He thought he was invincible, smart enough to outsmart the system. But now, the truth was crawling its way to the surface, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the tension in the room mounted, Ethan's composure began to break. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. He felt as though he were drowning in the weight of his own guilt, his own lies. The truth was slipping from his mouth, unbidden, like a floodgate that couldn't be closed. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, there was something different in his gaze. The coldness, the detachment, was gone. What remained was a raw, unfiltered version of himself, vulnerable, exposed. "I did it," Ethan whispered, barely audible. "I killed her." Miller didn't speak right away. She let the words sink in. The confession was shocking, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't the whole truth. Ethan's voice cracked as he continued, "She controlled me. She had my life in her hands every single day. She made me feel like I wasn't good enough. I had to be perfect, everything had to be perfect for her, but I was never good enough. No matter what I did, it was never enough." He paused, the weight of his words sinking in. "She didn't love me. Not really. She only loved the version of me that she could control. She loved the idea of me, but not me. Not who I really was. And when I realized that, when I understood that I would never be her perfect son, that's when I knew I had to do it. I had to end it." Miller listened, her face emotionless, but inside, she was disgusted. Ethan's confession wasn't one of remorse, it was one of cold justification. He didn't feel sorry for what he'd done, he felt entitled to have done it. It was clear now that Carol's death had been the culmination of years of psychological torment, a torment that had twisted Ethan's mind, pushing him to murder. It's all coming to light now, but the real question is, what does Ethan feel? Is there any remorse hiding behind those cold eyes? How much of this is his fault, and how much of it is the product of years of emotional abuse? Stay tuned to find out. The confession is chilling, but the deeper question remains, how does someone like Ethan get to this point? Hit that subscribe button to continue following this twisted journey as we uncover the darkest corners of his mind. Ethan's confession wasn't just a verbal admission, it was a window into his warped, delusional world. The way he described the murder, the way he described his freedom after Carol's death, was chilling. His voice remained steady as he recalled the exact moment he had taken the knife to his mother's chest, not with remorse, but with satisfaction. "I watched her struggle. I watched her gasp for air, and it felt good," Ethan admitted, his voice hollow. "It was like everything I had suffered from her was finally over. She had taken so much from me, and in that moment, I took something back. My life. My freedom. The confession hung heavy in the air, like a storm cloud ready to break. Ethan sat there, the weight of his words settling on his shoulders. There was no going back now. He had admitted it, and there was no escape from the consequences. Detective Miller's eyes never wavered from him. "You're not the victim here, Ethan," she said coldly. "You're the one who chose this." As Ethan sat there, the reality of his situation began to seep in. His life, as he had known it, was over. The truth was out, and there would be no more hiding. The final chapter of his twisted journey was about to unfold. Ethan thought he had finally confessed. He thought the truth was out, but as the investigation reached its final stages, a new revelation turned everything he had said upside down. A small detail, a missing piece, began to pull apart the story he had so carefully crafted. Could it be that the truth Ethan revealed wasn't the whole truth? Or was there a deeper, darker layer to his crime, a secret that Ethan had buried even deeper than his mother's body? In the weeks following Ethan's confession, the investigation had seemed like a linear path. He had admitted to the murder, his motivations were clear, and the evidence supported his claim. The case appeared closed, ready to go to trial. Ethan was caught, and the authorities had all the pieces they needed to prosecute him. But Detective Miller wasn't satisfied. There was something about Ethan's confession that didn't sit right. The details he provided were too clean, too rehearsed. The cold, clinical way he spoke of his mother's murder, almost as if it was an intellectual exercise rather than a crime of passion, disturbed her. And as the days passed, the feeling that something was off grew stronger. She went back to the crime scene one more time. She walked through the house, re-examining every corner, every piece of evidence. It was during this quiet, solitary walkthrough that she stumbled upon the crucial clue, the one that would unravel everything. In the attic, tucked away in an old box of forgotten family mementos, Miller found something that changed everything, a recording. It wasn't anything obvious, like a voice memo or a video. It was a small, hidden cassette tape, labeled only with the date of Carol's death. With nothing but a sense of urgency guiding her, Miller rushed to the police station and had the tape played. The tape was of a phone call. Carol's voice was faint, but it was unmistakable. She was speaking to someone, a woman, an old friend, and the conversation was casual at first, but then it turned serious. "I'm really worried about Ethan. He's been acting strange. I'm not sure what to do anymore," Carol's voice said. "He's withdrawn, distant, and it feels like there's a part of him I can't reach. I think he's angry at me, but I don't know why. It's like he's becoming someone else. I don't know if I'm overreacting, but I don't feel safe anymore." The conversation grew more desperate, and it became clear that Carol had been aware of the growing darkness in her son. But that wasn't what shocked Miller. It was the final part of the conversation. "I don't think I can do this anymore," Carol said, almost breaking down. "I've tried everything. He's a stranger to me now. I'm afraid of what he might do. I just hope I'm wrong." The line went dead. Detective Miller sat back in shock. This recording was not just a confession, it was a haunting reflection of the fear Carol had felt. And in it, she had mentioned something critical, the feeling that Ethan was becoming someone else, someone dangerous. Miller's mind raced as she pieced together the implications of the tape. Carol had been afraid of Ethan. She had known what he was capable of, even before the murder. The chilling realization dawned on her: Ethan had been manipulating the narrative from the start. The confession he had given, the way he had portrayed himself as the victim of his mother's cruelty, was a carefully constructed lie. What if Ethan hadn't been the victim? What if he had been the one manipulating everyone around him long before the murder? His calm demeanor, his rehearsed responses, and even the way he confessed now made sense in a different light. Miller returned to Ethan, her mind filled with new questions. Ethan had claimed to act out of rage, to free himself from his mother's control. But had that truly been the driving force? Or had he simply been playing a game, one that allowed him to control the narrative from behind bars? The twist came in the form of a new revelation: Ethan hadn't acted alone. There had been someone else involved in the planning of Carol's murder. someone who had been in contact with Ethan weeks before the crime, feeding into his twisted sense of justice. Miller's investigation revealed that Ethan had been speaking to someone, a mentor figure, someone he trusted deeply. The person had been part of an online group for those struggling with controlling parents, but it quickly became clear that the advice Ethan had received from them was far more sinister than simple therapy. This person, identified as Travis Monroe, had been an older man who had befriended Ethan online. Monroe, a former convict with a history of violent behavior, had been providing Ethan with guidance, telling him that his mother was the source of his misery and that he needed to take control of his life, even if it meant going to extreme measures. The chilling part? Monroe had been in the area the night of the murder. His alibi had been weak, and a search of his home uncovered a series of communications with Ethan in the days leading up to the crime. It seemed that Monroe had fueled Ethan's rage, convincing him that killing his mother would be an act of liberation. Miller couldn't believe what she was uncovering. Ethan hadn't been the lone architect of his mother's death. He had been influenced by someone darker, someone who had preyed on his vulnerable state. This case has just taken a shocking turn. Who is Travis Monroe, and how far did his influence on Ethan go? Could Ethan have been pushed to murder by someone else? Stick with us to unravel the shocking truth. If you think you've heard it all, wait until you hear what happens next. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to make sure you're with us as we dig even deeper into this chilling case. The truth about the murder was even darker than Miller had imagined. It wasn't just about Ethan's rage against his mother, it was about manipulation and control. Ethan had been convinced that Carol's death was not just an act of revenge, but an act of liberation. He described the murder in disturbing detail, how he had waited for his mother to be alone, how he had felt a twisted sense of calm as he approached her. But now, with Monroe's influence exposed, Miller realized that this sense of calm had been fed to him. It wasn't all Ethan's doing. The violence, the brutality, it had been nurtured by someone else. Monroe had planted the seed of murder in Ethan's mind, feeding him the idea that he could escape his mother's control permanently. Ethan's confession now felt like a half-truth. The rage and the need for freedom were real, but they had been exacerbated by Monroe's twisted advice. The guilt wasn't entirely his. In a way, Ethan had been groomed for this moment by someone who understood the power of manipulation. Ethan sat in the interrogation room, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling. He had confessed once, but now everything he had said seemed to fall apart. Detective Miller could see the cracks in his story, the parts that didn't make sense. And as the truth began to unfold, Ethan realized that the lies he had woven around his actions were no longer enough to protect him. Miller stood in front of him, her voice cold. "Ethan, your story isn't the whole truth. There's more to this than you've admitted. You weren't acting alone, and you knew it. You were being fed lies, manipulated into believing you had no choice but to kill your mother." Ethan looked up at her, his face blank. For the first time, there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. The pressure had finally caught up with him. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the truth was undeniable. Ethan had been the instrument of his mother's death, but he was not the sole mastermind. And as the investigation continued, the shocking twist of Monroe's involvement promised to turn the entire case on its head. The truth was finally laid bare. Ethan could no longer hide behind his lies, no longer pretend that he was the victim of a cruel, controlling mother. The reality was far more complicated, and far more tragic. As the full scope of his crime came to light, Ethan found himself trapped in a prison of his own making. His confession, his manipulation, and the shocking involvement of Travis Monroe had all led to this moment, a reckoning. But would Ethan truly face the consequences of his actions, or would he continue to spiral further into his own delusion? In the end, justice would be served, but not in the way anyone expected. The weeks after Ethan's confession were filled with a sense of finality. The investigation into Carol's murder had reached its conclusion, and the truth, painful, twisted, and horrifying, had been exposed. Ethan had been arrested, and the charges against him were serious: first-degree murder, conspiracy, and manipulation. He was no longer just the troubled son of an overbearing mother. He was the cold-blooded killer of Carol Anderson, and the world had finally learned the truth. As he sat in his prison cell, Ethan's once composed facade had cracked. The quiet, emotionless killer who had stood before Detective Miller, proudly confessing to his crime, was now a shell of the person he had been. His mind, which had been so meticulously calculated, was unraveling. The cold satisfaction he once felt at the death of his mother had morphed into something else: guilt, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of loss. Ethan had always prided himself on being in control. But now, in his isolation, the weight of his actions pressed down on him with unbearable force. The voices in his head, the thoughts that had driven him to murder, had started to consume him. He couldn't escape the truth anymore. He had taken his mother's life, and nothing he did could undo it. The trial loomed large on the horizon, and as it approached, new details about Ethan's psychological state began to emerge. His defense attorney, in a last-ditch effort to save him from a life sentence, argued that Ethan had been under the influence of external manipulation, specifically, the guidance and encouragement of Travis Monroe, the man who had fed him lies about his mother and justified the murder. The defense painted Ethan as a vulnerable young man, manipulated by a predator who had preyed on his deep-seated need for validation and control. But as the defense presented their case, the prosecution pushed back with overwhelming evidence. They showed the jury Ethan's journals, his unsettling online communications with Monroe, and his calculated actions on the night of Carol's death. They revealed the chilling conversations between Ethan and his mentor, showing how Monroe had incited Ethan's violence, providing him with a justification for murder. But even in the face of this evidence, Ethan remained unrepentant. He had been manipulated, yes, but he had also been complicit. The final blow came when a psychologist testified that Ethan had shown clear signs of narcissistic personality disorder, a condition that made him incapable of feeling true empathy for others. He had viewed his mother's death not as an act of violence, but as a means to an end, a way to achieve the freedom he had craved for so long. Throughout the trial, Ethan's emotions shifted from numb detachment to fleeting moments of anger. He had always been able to hide behind his cold, calculating exterior, but now, in the face of overwhelming evidence, he began to crack. The prosecution's relentless questioning revealed a side of Ethan that no one had seen before, the fear and guilt that had been buried deep inside him, the same guilt that had been consuming him since the moment he killed his mother. As Ethan sat in the courtroom, he stared at the empty seat where Carol should have been. It was the first time in weeks that he allowed himself to truly feel the weight of his actions. His mother had been more than just a figure of control and manipulation. She had been the one person who had always tried to shape him into something better, something more than he was. She had loved him, in her own twisted way, and he had destroyed that love with one brutal act of violence. The real twist came during closing arguments when Travis Monroe was called to testify. The prosecution had found Monroe, who had been on the run since the murder. The man who had fueled Ethan's rage and given him the twisted advice to kill his mother was now standing in court, his face cold and distant. Monroe had been hiding in plain sight, a former convict who had slipped through the cracks. He had managed to manipulate Ethan from a distance, encouraging his violent tendencies, telling him that he deserved more than his mother's suffocating love. He was the missing piece in the puzzle, the one who had poisoned Ethan's mind, feeding his delusions and making him believe that killing Carol was his only path to freedom. As Monroe took the stand, he offered no remorse. He described his interactions with Ethan in clinical terms, as though he were speaking about a patient rather than a young man he had guided toward murder. His cold demeanor only further cemented Ethan's guilt, and the jury quickly recognized the full scope of the manipulation that had taken place. But it was too late for Ethan. The damage had already been done. His actions had sealed his fate, and no amount of outside influence could excuse the horror he had caused. The truth about Travis Monroe's role in this murder is chilling. How far did his influence on Ethan go? Was Monroe the real mastermind behind the tragedy, or was Ethan simply a puppet who couldn't escape the strings? Keep watching as we dive into the final moments of Ethan's trial. If you think this story is over, you're in for a surprise. The consequences are still unfolding. Hit that subscribe button to continue following the twists and turns of this tragic case. As the trial came to a close, the jury deliberated for days, weighing the evidence against Ethan. The judge, who had witnessed Ethan's cold demeanor throughout the trial, made a final statement before the verdict was read. This is a case of profound loss. A mother's death at the hands of her son is tragic beyond measure. But in this court, justice will be served. Ethan's expression remained unchanged as the jury filed in. His hands, still trembling slightly, rested on the table. He had been given a life sentence, no chance for parole. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a reminder of the horrors his actions had caused. As the courtroom erupted in chaos, with Carol's family and friends sobbing in the back, Ethan sat motionless, his eyes staring ahead. The finality of the verdict had not changed him. There was no remorse, no emotional breakdown. Instead, there was only emptiness. Ethan was escorted from the courtroom, his head held high, his face devoid of emotion. The long walk to the holding cell felt like an eternity. He had been convicted, yes, but for Ethan, the world he had known was already gone. The lies, the manipulation, the murders, everything had led to this moment. He was now a prisoner of his own making, a prisoner of his mind, of his twisted sense of justice. As the cell door slammed shut behind him, Ethan stared at the cold walls of his new home, his thoughts drifting back to the day of the murder. The sense of freedom, the satisfaction of taking control, those feelings were still there, lingering in the back of his mind. But now, in the silence of the prison, the truth was undeniable. He had killed his mother. And nothing he could do could ever change that.